I would like to ask you about the pain paradox. Tell us about that. I understand it on maybe a real high level. So give me some details about that. Coach me on that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the talk, I look at bias from three different standpoints. One is the pain, one is the paradox, and one is the power of bias. And so the pain part of the talk is really just talking about my journey, where I grew up. We were the only Indian family in an all Italian neighborhood. So, like I was telling you earlier, I dealt with bullying and harassment. And so, there was an incident that I talk about that you alluded to earlier where, I dealt with a lot of bullying and harassment. I mean, my parents had accents, they barely spoke English, we had the darker skin, so one of the incidents I talk about in the pain part of the talk is when I was in high school, I found a note taped to my locker door that said, "Go back to your country." And at this point in my life, I was a normal teenager. I was acting out, I was fighting back. I found myself defending myself, which I should be anyway. And it just was a really sort of a dark period in my life. And
Mm-hmm.
at that time, and still to this day, we don't have a lot of resources for kids that are going through that, especially immigrant kids. There's really no one to talk to. There's no one at school. I mean, again, we were the only Indian family in this predominantly Italian neighborhood. So there's not a lot of resources. The only person I really had was my father. And even with him, these conversations would just be about, stop doing that, otherwise you're going to get kicked out of school.
Yeah.
Those kind of
Yeah.
conversations. And so he would always kind of tell me these, and I talk about this about, he would always give me a couple pieces of advice, right? And he would say, Sejal, if people are hurting you, then they themselves are hurting inside. He would always tell me that. And that's kind of a little bit starting to talk about the paradox of bias, is that bias isn't one dimensional. It impacts all of us, right? In one way or another, regardless of the side you're on, whether you're the victim or you're the one that's actually doing the harassment or bullying. So he would always say, if someone's hurting inside, then they hurt other people. And then he would always remind me that, look, we're all capable of being hurtful and harming other people. And so the paradox of bias was, he always let me know, like, this could be any one of us that is doing this to somebody else. And that's what he would tell me. And that really actually helped me kind of get through my teenage years, as I would find myself in these situations where I was like, I'm not going to become a victim to this circumstance. I'm going to figure out a way that I can help people who feel this way, who are going through this. And so
Okay.
that led to law school. And then I talk about, you would think most people, if they heard my story about what I went through growing up and they knew that I went to law school, they would probably expect that I would end up defending
Yes.
people
Yeah.
who were being harassed
That
or
was a shock to hear that. So wait a minute. Did I
right.
hear that right? Let me replay that.
Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
and that's the twist in my story. That's the paradox where I talk about, now here I was representing people who were accused of harassing and bullying
Yes.
other people.
Yes.
Such a huge part of my story, because that is where I really had to deal with my own personal biases to be able to do the job and be an attorney and be successful at it. So I had to work through my own biases, but then I also saw a lot of people who were accused of harassing and discriminating, and there were, of course, there were some bad actors. So I'm not saying
Yeah.
everybody was this way. There's always a few rotten apples, and I put them back there somewhere. But majority of the people that I was dealing with who were accused of harassing and discriminating were actually, I felt they were well intentioned people. They
Mm.
just had these unconscious biases that maybe they weren't aware of, or they just needed education. They were ignorant. There was, lack of awareness, lack of education. So
Wow.
I found myself training a lot and educating a lot people on bias and these issues. And so that's the paradox of my story. And really the lessons that my dad was teaching me as I was growing up really started to come and really hit heavy, because I realized, like, wow, okay, they're just as much as a victim as I am of what I've gone through, and they were exposed to what they were exposed to, so they're also victims in this as well. And really helped me see it, and I think really helps me do the work that I do, because I could build those bridges a little bit easier because I've seen it from both ends.
So then that really does lay out the story of the pain paradox. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it draws it all together. I mean, you're helping the people who are in pain. And the paradox
Mm-hmm.
is they're reaching out to hurt people sometimes. And to create pain, but
Yeah.
that's because they're in pain. That's interesting. And like I said, I was really shocked when you said you defend those folks. I said,
Hmm.
wait a minute, but you have to
Yeah.
listen to the whole thing.